Hey, Star, you gonna perform for us? Hey, Star, perform. Good day, welcome to Great White Retro. I'm Gord Fessick, and this is my wife's cat, Star, or at least the back end of him. Our topic today is this find we got from Winnipeg last summer, an original Macintosh Special Edition. We've got some peripherals to try out with it, assuming we can get the thing to work. We'll make sure that this thing is safe before powering it on, and with any luck, we might be able to get this thing working on the first try. Let's get her done. Before we even think about powering this thing on, I want to make sure there are no refa capacitors in here on its power supply. To that end, we're going to make use of the Mac Cracker set that I got from Princess Auto. So taking a Mac apart is a little tricky because this thing will grip onto the rear of that case. Turns out what I had to do was to brace the case with a screw partially loosened. So don't remove the screw, just loosen it, and then you can brace against the screwdriver to pull the case out of place. And then you can remove that screw and remove the case cover. So what the guy did is he drilled a hole into the logic board for this drive and tried to get to one of the platters. That would have destroyed the hard drive, which is deliberate in case there's any personal information on this machine. But that's okay, but we need to remove this drive or at least have it disconnected before we can try connecting any of our own equipment to this. So it looks like the drive is disconnected. There's just the floppy drive. With any luck, this might work just as it is. Now let's take a look carefully at this power supply for any refa capacitors. Okay. So right there is C12. It says C12, but it's upside down. That looks like a filter cap. There are smaller filter caps back here. And these don't look like the refa branded. It's quite possible that these have already been replaced. Easier for us. So I wonder what era of Macintosh actually had the refas in it, if at all. Anyway, first thing to come out is the main board because I want to inspect it for any battery damage. I don't see any battery damage, but I'm pretty sure that Varta battery is ready to come out of there. I'll replace that with a CR2032 battery holder later on. Let's give it a power on test now that we know that it's somewhat safe. At least it shouldn't explode. Alright, it's plugged into a separate power strip with a toggle on it with an attempt to make sure it doesn't fail. Okay, so let's toggle that. Alright, so far no smoke. That's encouraging already. Indeed it is. It took quite a while. I don't know what was going on here, but I think eventually it asked for a floppy disk. Now, I had a problem at this point. I didn't have any Macintosh floppy disks, or so I thought anyway. Where was I going to get some of these? Turned out I had this little floppy that came with the Mac, but it's a high-density disk, so it didn't work. It spit the thing out right away. Oops. But I did have this other collection of discs that I had. It's a long story about where I got those from. It's actually part of a much, much larger collection of 3.5-inch floppies I got for a different computer entirely. But amazingly, this thing boots. Well, thank goodness for that. And this machine was going to get converted into a fishbowl, according to the folks at Mother Earth Recycling, and I'm like, wow, what a waste. Good thing I caught it when I did.
That mouse seemed to work okay. The only problem was that, yeah, I got no response out of it there. I think one of the ADP ports on the back was actually bad, so I tried swapping it. That's a bad idea. Don't try to swap it with the power on. All they succeeded in doing was locking up the keyboard, although the mouse did work for a little while. The minute I tried typing something, the machine just locked up. Well, so much for that idea. Well, after a quick power cycle, I tried again. It booted off the floppy right away without as long as of a delay, so that helped. Now this version of Mac OS didn't recognize the keyboard I had attached to it, so it didn't display any keycaps, but it did register keystrokes at least. So that's encouraging. I could try setting the date and time. The problem is that Varta battery was so old and it wasn't holding much of a charge anymore, this Mac would not retain the date and time. But at least we can shut this thing down safely. So next I try hooking up this Apple CD 300. This is a drive I picked up from a neighboring county. Now it turns out, yeah, the Mac OS 603 does not have support for CD-ROMs natively. The firmware on this Mac does not support CD-ROMs either. There is an extension you can load to get it to work, but I had to order that from another person. I ended up ordering a complete set of floppies to deal with that. I also ordered this RAM here from an outfit called Memory Masters. They are an eBay vendor. And with that, I was able to try to upgrade this thing to at least 4 megabytes. That seems to be the limit for a Mac SE with a 68,000 processor, which would do for the purposes of this little machine. Those plastic snaps are pretty fragile, so I was really careful when it came to doing those. Okay, I was in here earlier and I pulled out the hard drive. It was an older Seagate ST series, probably just as well that it got removed in spite of it possibly working because, well, I've dealt with the old ST series back when I had an Amiga 500 and later when I had an Amiga 1000 with a Phoenix board. They were not the most reliable drive. As soon as I was able to get a cheap 1 gig drive, I got it. Anyway, here's the floppy drive. It actually tips forward, or it's supposed to tip forward. There we go. And then I can lift it out. And I'll be able to install another hard drive in here someday. But I'm not going to worry about it right now. I gave the floppy drive a bit of an air spray. We need to do more servicing to this yet, but it does seem to work, so I'm not going to futz with it too much. To put it back in, I need to be careful because these tabs need to fit on openings on the board. Let's see if I can show you quickly. So these two things on the bottom here, just below that, yeah, I'm trying to get the light behind it. I need to make sure that the tabs on the drive cage fit those openings over there. Otherwise, the drive will not be seated right and you won't be able to insert or remove disks. Okay, so let's get that reinserted so that we can at least get this going again. I had a hard time trying to fit this thing in here. It actually does have some pressure fittings, like some of the metal is spread out a little bit, but it did get in there eventually, and it's held in place with 4 screws onto the main case. Next, let's put the board back in there. Now what happens is when you're putting the board in and out, you first have to reconnect the speaker cable, which is a pretty tight one to try to fit in there, but it does get in there. Next comes the power cable for the main board that comes off of the analog board, which is the one sitting perpendicular, then the floppy cable, and eventually a hard drive cable once the floppy cable is in. Okay, put the RF shield back in there, and the case cover. Okay, so I've got a hard drive attached there, and I also ordered this set of installation discs from another eBay vendor that I will link to in the video. But that Lacy hard drive actually came with enough stuff that I could get quite a decent system going. I was able to install System 608. And nope, that's not the right amount of RAM here. Hang on a second. Let's go back and check that. That's only 2 megabytes. Turns out I need to clip this resistor here where it says RAM size. And one row, I clip that to enable the second row. Right, let's try that again. That's better, 4096 kilobytes.
Alright, so a couple of different things I've done to this Macintosh. First, I took a hard drive from another hard drive cage. Ended up being this Sature ProLine. It's actually an HP branded drive, 220 megabytes. So used to seeing gigabytes. And because I had to mount this drive upside down compared to the Seagate over there, I had to split the cable apart into a few pieces. So it's twisted like that, and so that it fits in the connector there on the main board. Alright, so we got that. I also replaced the Varta battery that was in there that I thought was a capacitor with a CR2032 socket. And I ended up following another YouTuber who I will link in the video description. Thanks so much for the assistance there. And the real-time clock on here is actually keeping time now. So now this Mac SE has a hard drive again. And this hard drive happens to have a copy of Mac OS 7 on it. So with any luck, we can get this thing a little more up to date. Okay, let's let this start up here. There we go. Welcome to Macintosh. I have no clue if it's possible to get an iPhone to sync up with the old scan rates of these machines. Okay, about this Mac says it's running System 701. It's got 4 megabytes of RAM, 3.2 is free, and that is the built-in hard drive, which I'm going to reformat later on. Yep, that's the correct date and the correct time. Hopefully this holds.
So with all that sorted out, let's begin disassembling this computer for cleanup. The very first thing I want to do is ground out the cathode ray tube in there. CRTs can kill. There are tens of thousands of volts between ground and that suction cup there. So first I plug the machine in to my power strip. I make sure the power strip is turned off, and that way it's grounded to electrical ground. I will then clamp my cable onto my screwdriver. I'll poke underneath the cap. I did not feel or hear any kerpop So I'm guessing that the bleed-off resistor in the Macintosh did its job. With that, I can safely disassemble this Macintosh. First comes out the hard drive and floppy drive cage, and also the PDS peripheral bracket had to come out so that I could remove the hard drive. After loosening up those, I put the screws back in there so I wouldn't lose them. But after that, the hard drive and floppy drive came out. Next, let's get that analog board and power supply out of there. That is one piece. There are 4 screws near the bottom of the case that hold it in place. There are tabs on the metal case that hold it in place. And there we go, now it's loose. We can't quite remove it yet. We need to disconnect the CRT from that analog board though. Off comes the neck board off the back of the CRT. And then that other connector that powers the CRT comes off. Powers the deflection yoke. Okay. Next, let's get the metal bracket off. That's the main metal part of the case. And then we can detach the CRT by unscrewing the DAG ground screws and then gently placing it into another container for safekeeping. I am not a CRT expert. I basically followed 8-Bit Guy's disassembly steps when dealing with this. Finally, I removed this speaker. And like his machine, this speaker has some melted plastic bits that hold the speaker in place, so I simply cut those and removed the speaker. Next, I'm going to put the 2 case halves back together so it'll be easier to clean. Also easier to put in my slop sink for retrobrighting. Right, I fastened the screws back in, the case screws, so now it's back in one piece. This case is a mess. You can even see a major color difference. Someone had this poster attached to the side and with some very stubborn tape with adhesive that had a hard time coming off, so I had to use alcohol to remove that. And you could clearly see a difference in color between the exposed and unexposed parts of the plastic. But after some effort, we got all that adhesive off of there, and I was able to use a nail brush to get in the cracks there. The other side had another similar poster plastered onto it, and again you can see the color difference between the exposed and unexposed bits of the case. I wonder what kind of poster that was. Anyway, more soap and water, more alcohol, and more baking soda. Alcohol especially to get rid of that stuck adhesive. Scrubbing all the way around the feet. These feet are in good shape, just had to keep them clean. Alright, with the alcohol treatment done, next comes the baking soda to remove any scuffs or any other adhesive that the alcohol may have missed. This took quite some effort. This Mac has been through a lot, especially in that warehouse at Mother Earth. But hey, after some significant scrubbing, the case looks much better. All we're missing now is the Retrobright. And I have a cunning plan for retrobrighting this Macintosh.
So one reason I was worried about picking up this project was I didn't have enough peroxide to fill my entire slop sink to be able to submerge this entire Macintosh. But fortunately, as a result of my little playing around with the VIC-20, I have a better solution.
This is the peroxide paste I made in the last episode. This has had some time to gel up now, so it's a lot more consistent than what it was. After a quick run in a blender, I smoothed it out some, added a little bit more peroxide just to kind of make sure it was fully charged up. And then I was able to coat this case with my peroxide paste. This is about the same consistency as David Murray's Salon Cream, which he has used on this style of Mac case before. I try my best to cover up every part of this case with the cling wrap. I was going to say plastic wrap, but I still have to get the sides here and then wrap up the sides. This actually took 2 days because it spent about 3.5 hours under the UV lights, and it wasn't quite ready, but I still want to take it apart and not have it exposed to that peroxide, so I cleaned it up and I wrapped it up and covered it a second time. This is actually the beginning of day 2 where I've got this in here. I've got my keys in there as well. And I've also got the keyboard in there, which I took apart earlier. I know I didn't show taking apart the keyboard. Sorry about that. I will show you putting it back together, however, in a bit. So after the first day, I was able to take this plastic wrap off of here, give the keyboard case a bit of a scrub, and see that it was better, but still was a little bit yellowed. So I set this aside, gave myself some sleep, and then set it up for the next day. I also did the mouse covers, the mouse case, and the keys. But the keys didn't turn out very well either. Soaking just underneath the UV lights wasn't enough. I'm going to try using my stove again the next day. Here's the case after day 1. We'll unwrap this again. I don't know if you can see it on camera, but I do give this a scrub and I could still see a difference where those posters were uncovered versus covered. So while it's better as well, it needs to go in for another day. You might not be able to see it, but I sure can. Get up now. So, day 2. I get my pot and my stove ready here. I'm using the back burner, the lowest burner I've got. And it's set to the lowest level of heat that I could get away with on a gas stove. I'm cutting my peroxide down again to about 10% this time. Alright, and getting it in there. I used tap water to start, and it measured at about just over 40 C, or about 108 F. But after the double boiler got as far as it did, I put the pot back on there, I put the lid on, and turned the heat right down to as low as it could go. And it left it for about like an hour. There we go. So, fast forward to an hour and a bit later, the water temperature's all the way up to 82 C, 84 C. That's like, okay, that's enough. This has to come off the stove now. I don't want to risk melting the keys like I did last time with the Commodore 128. As it turned out, these keys turned out much better, but the spacebar did deform ever so slightly. At least it was apparent to me that it deformed, although it actually did fit. And since you didn't get to see me take the keyboard apart, I'm going to show you putting the keyboard back together. There's the spacebar stabilizer. Unlike the Commodore 128 keyboard, this spacebar actually fit a little bit better, even though it deformed ever so slightly. The spacebar stabilizer goes into a couple of snaps there. And there's that one. Instead of springs, Mitsumi opted for these little rubber things that act as springs. But I was able to get that lined up. Yep, and the spacebar works freely. Thank goodness for that. And now I can show you a key insert montage. The larger keys also had stabilizers, so I made sure to do those ones first. They worked out rather well. So the keypad enter key, both shift keys, and the caps lock key all had stabilizers on them. And with that done, let's get to reinserting the rest of the keys. And finally, the Apple key. Now, coming back to the keyboard frame, which had been sitting in a peroxide wrap for a second day, it was in there for about 2.5 hours, and I can already tell it is much improved. A good wash later, and there's the bottom half, so we can use that as a control, and the top half is an almost exact match. And there we go, we'll take that. While the rest of the case is still downstairs under the UV lights, I put this keyboard back together. There's a pressure-fitted ribbon cable that goes to join the keyboard mainboard to the keyboard circuit board itself, and some screws to hold it in place into the bottom half of the keyboard case. The top half of the keyboard case attaches like a hinge. There's this reset button, but it's snapped off. I had to tape it in place before I could install the top half of the keyboard case. And it attaches like a hinge. There's 3 hinges in the back that have to fit before this top cover will snap correctly into place. I do have another Apple Desktop Bus keyboard, so if this doesn't work out, I can try cleaning up the other one, but the other one is missing one keycap, so I'm going to have to find a replacement for that. And there we go. This wasn't quite working though because it wasn't sitting on the hinges on the back. I fixed that up later on. Next, let's put this mouse back together, which was much simpler. The main mouse assembly fit into the bottom half of the mouse case with just 3 screws. And then the top half of the mouse case fit on top of that. We're spoiled today with optical mice that don't even require special mouse pads anymore. I gave the cable a bit of a scrub as well. Ended up using a nail brush on the ADB connector because it looked pretty dirty. A little bit of that, and that cleaned up. So I got a bit of a problem. This keyboard had 4 feet. 2 of them were missing already, and I only have these 2 left. When I removed these, I also removed some adhesive from the insides of these openings. And it looked like double-sided tape, so I might as well just use double-sided tape to replace these feet. I tried cutting the double-sided tape to fit, but it just wouldn't stay on these rubber feet. So I ended up resorting to my good friend Contact Cement. Plan C. But Plan C did work out. 15 minutes later, I came back to attach the feet to the keyboard. Now I put them on the bottom because the keyboard's going to be resting on those standoffs anyway, so the rubber feet should go on the bottom anyway. And finally I came back downstairs to pick up the rest of the Macintosh case, which had been sitting in here for an additional 3 hours compared to the day before. It looks much better from here. Let's see what happens when we get the plastic wrap off. Oh yeah, I can tell without scrubbing that it's looking much better, but still that peroxide is a hazard. Let's get it off of there. And after a thorough scrubbing and rinsing, I'll set this aside. There we go. As good as new. No outline anymore on the sides. The back is good, the front is good, the sides are good. Now, after a good drying off, we can put this back together. I used more contact cement to put the speaker back into place. Next comes the metal frame and its 5 Torx screws. You may notice that I have pieces of it fastened to here, that way I didn't lose anything. Next, let's get that board back out of there so that we can mount the back of the metal case. Now comes the CRT. We fasten its 4 dead ground screws to the front of the case. Next comes the analog board and its power supply. It slides in like this. It fastens into place with its 4 screws near the bottom of the case. This was a little tricky, so I put the screws in, but I didn't fully tighten them down because I needed to line them up. I had to grab onto the metal case to get those holes to line up. Finally, once I got all 4 screws in place, I was able to tighten it down. There we go. Let's hook the CRT back up to the analog board, starting with the deflection yoke first, then the neck board. Then the dag ground. And finally that suction cup. Next, let's remove this PDS bracket so that we can put the hard drive and floppy drive back in there. Next, let's get the main board back in there. And the speaker cable, power cable, floppy cable, and hard drive cable, in that order. RF shield comes next. Let's give it a test. We've got sound. We've got picture. That hard drive was bootable at first. Okay, we got a mouse pointer. We've got a boot screen. We got burn-in. Let's check the date and time first. Okay, that's the right time. That's the wrong date, though. Yeah. We got one problematic key. I'll fix that key off camera. But at least the rest of the Mac seems to be working, and we've got 4 megabytes of RAM, we've got a working hard drive. And finally, let's get the main case cover back on. Barring any major changes, this should be the last time I need to take this Macintosh apart. Here's a before shot with the yellowed keyboard and yellowed case. And the after shot. Everything fully brightened up. And working copies of Tetris. When I started this hobby, I promised myself I wouldn't work on any 16-bit computers because I figured my skill set wasn't up to the task of dealing with surface mount components. Now this Macintosh just fell into my lap for a mere $30, so why not? But unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for you, I've since stumbled on another 16-bit system that you will all get to see in a future episode. But right now, it's crunch time. It is the end of August, which means autumn is coming up and lots of yard work is happening. And I've got 2 big shows coming up, one at the end of October and one at the end of November. And on top of that, I'll be attending VCF Midwest just outside of Chicago, Illinois on September 9th and 10th. Hope to see you guys there. Until then, good day.